No matter how you found us, thank you all for joining us and thank you all for coming in. It's really great to see you all here, and we're going to get ready to rock and roll for a great program. Next up is going to be our Navigating the AI Landscape Security, Ethics, and Legalities panel. Joining us first will be Chitra Dorai as our moderator.
Good day, everyone, wherever you might be tuning in from. Thank you for making the time to be with us. In the previous panel, we walked through a world of citizen-grade AI use cases and business-grade use cases. And undercurrent through all of them were these concerns of personal safety and security and ethical considerations, and as well as legalities. So that's what our panel is going to. We are going to get into the thornier issues of everything the previous panel alluded to. And so we have assembled a fantastic slate of accomplished leaders to help us unpack. Michael, I see Michael. Without going into the bio of everyone, we'll use up the entire hour to list out all the accomplishments our panelists have. Michael is going to bring us his security-focused perspectives. Radha works hard at data and governance. And we also have Anusha, who is an attorney by trade. And we are going to delve right into the legalities of our use of AI and the business use of AI. And Radha, who is following the EU AI Act to understand what regulations are coming up and what business are expected to follow. So with that, we are going to dive right into it. Michael, we heard a number of use cases, both what I would call citizen AI as well as business AI. Can you elaborate on the use cases that have particularly security as a concern, as a paramount consideration?
Yeah, so thank you for that. From my perspective in my organization, we're looking at use cases that help us for data analysis, right? But staying away from any customer data, right? Because we're not ready for that. We don't have an appetite for that at this point. An example of what that means is we have a lot of regulations that apply to the organization. And we have policies, standards, procedures that have been developed for the organization that also are supposed to align to those regulations. We can ask AI to analyze all that to say, hey, do you see any gaps or issues with that? That's helpful to us, right? Because to have humans do that kind of work, it's a big lift, and we still may have some errors, right? So that's an example of data analysis. Also looking at contracts, due diligence answers from due diligence questionnaires, or other forms of data analysis. It could do it in rapid speed, and it basically helps us, right? Because I look at AI, my perspective is it's like having a personal research assistant, right? It enables us, it improves our processes, it speeds up our processes, and it's helpful. It's not replacing us, but it's very helpful for our staff that has to manage these kind of functions.
Thank you, Mike. So Radha, Mike mentioned, I lost count of how many times he mentioned data. So data is the fuel of everything, all the use cases he mentioned about. So how do we need to think about data safety and what's being done?
That's an excellent question, Chitra. So data is at the core of anything related to AI. Therefore, it's as corporations or those who offer these Gen AI technologies, it's their responsibility to make sure that the data that they use for creating these so-called large language models is pristine. It is cleaned. And some of these principles were already in play with the EU regulation on GDPR. But what happens in a Gen AI world is that the model is learning, it's being trained. After it's been trained, there can be some post-training. So there are other manipulations with data that can happen as well. It is therefore very important for anyone providing these technologies to have a governance process in place. There are certain principles of governance, and I know Anusha will go into a lot of detail on it as well. But from a technology point of view, you should be aware of the data that you have used for training these models. You have to make sure you're licensed to use that data, and there should be a way of assessing the risk of that data, because the data could be from a good source, but you have to make sure that it doesn't have certain attributes which make it unsafe to be used as is. We can talk about it later on how to address those. So I would say there would be the risk that you assessed from it as well. So it's governance, risk, and then of course there will always be compliance to certain methods. So I'll leave it at that for now, and we can delve into it later.
Can't wait for that, Radha. Thank you for that quick overview. Anusha, Radha already teed you up. I will tell you, as a citizen user of AI, I always see there are two major issues. One, when I present AI answer us, sometimes in my blog or in my paper, what risk am I opening myself to? I'm sure that's a concern of everyone who is using AI, ChatGPT or any other generative AI. On the other side, I know I have published a ton of paper. Some of my work probably is being used in training. So there is the other side of it. Could you unpack what legal risks exist and what are we doing about it?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you to this panel. I'm really excited to be a part of it. To answer your question, yeah, you hit the nail on the head with the IP piece of it, right? There's two sides to that coin. The first side is, and we're seeing this play out in a lot of high stakes disputes involving Meta, for example, involving a lot of different kinds of AI, like Midjourney. There's the first question is, are these LLMs, are they infringing upon existing copyrights or existing IP protections when they are using these data sets to train the models? So so Radha mentioned this, you need a license, or in some cases, there are some data sets that, according to their privacy policy or their terms of use, might allow you to go ahead and use that data set for your model. But a lot of cases, so for example, with the dispute involving Meta and the dispute involving Midjourney, it's trained, those models are trained on artists or content creators, their materials. And those artists and those creators are now alleging that these models did not have permission from those artists or those creators to use their work, that it's unauthorized use, that they were not compensated, et cetera, that was an infringement upon their existing protections, whether that's copyright, whether that's patent, or the other place we're seeing this play out is also in trade secrets, because the law is so unsettled and all these disputes are still pending. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it, Chitra, on the generative AI side, which is if you are using generative AI to develop content, how protected is that content under existing regulatory frameworks? I can speak about the USPTO, and I should do a quick disclaimer here. Anything that you hear from me today is not legal advice. I'm not representing anybody here. It's just based on my personal experiences. And in terms of the generative AI piece, the USPTO currently has a stance that if there's no human involvement and only an AI generates content, it is not protectable, right? But if you think about it, all AI has some level of human involvement, right? So the standard that they're using now to determine whether an AI-generated invention creation is protectable is to see if there's significant human involvement. But what does that mean? The USPTO has actually issued guidance. They've opened it up to comments. So a lot of stakeholders have been participating. So more guidance is expected this year and going forward. So this is also another space that is really important to watch, because if you're, for example, an author and you're like, hey, I want to use AI to develop to create my book cover. Now, is that a part of your copyright? It depends. Depends exactly what you prompted it and how involved you were in that prompting, in that review of it. And then that will determine based on principles, right? It's always these principles that then have to be applied to a specific set of facts. So that's how you can determine whether or not something's protectable or not. So it can be quite complex, and I think it's a super dynamic regulatory environment.
Space is still evolving, looks like. There is.
Absolutely. And that's just one piece of it, right? You also have so many other legal risks when it comes to data privacy, when it comes to bias, when it comes to transparency. Also this question about liability, right? So it's really easy when a person does something to say, okay, that person is liable, or a company does something, that company is liable. But if, let's say, there's a medical AI tool and there's a misdiagnosis, or there's an AI tool that then creates bias in the way that it's implemented, who's responsible for that? Is it the developers? Is it the users? Is it the system? These are also open questions that governments and regulatory authorities and bodies are trying to grapple with.
Thank you for that. So much to talk about in the next level of, look, just hearing you talk, there is so many complex issues intertwined. And so now that opens up the discussion to what are we doing about it? Are there things that we can do in the interim. Mike, I'm going to look back to you to say, given the outlay of all the considerations, security, data protection, and legal risk, what companies are doing to institute in terms of policies and training? Could you give us a flavor of what really happens behind the scene?
Yeah, I don't think it changes from AI to any other technology, right? You got to make sure that your organization can safeguard the data that's used in that technology, right? Especially if it's a cloud-based solution, such as most of these AI models, right? So we have to make sure we have the right safeguards in place to protect the company's intellectual property and customer data and things like that. Initially, my organization, we completely locked down the use of AI, right? Until we felt more comfortable that we added the right security controls or we validated the right security controls and protections that would safeguard that data. And then some of it is training and awareness, right? So getting the message out there to staff, this is what you can and should not do. These are the types of data you could use it for versus, hey, no, you should never use that for that. And then monitor it and then reach out to people and say, hey, wait, that kind of behavior, those kind of things need to stop, right? So we don't see a lot of that, but the point being is you got to get those principles out there. You got to get that security awareness and training. But then also it's having that dialogue. It's having the dialogue with leaders on these topics as well. Right, because you want to make sure that it's viewed across the organization and that we're not missing anything, right? So besides just security controls, right, a lot of it is the practices that we've implemented across the organization to make sure that, hey, there's not some business unit that's off doing something that we weren't even aware of. So it's having that dialogue with leaders on technology like this. But to sum it up, I don't treat AI any different. I treat, hey, we need to make sure our policies and standards are applied no matter if it's AI or some other cloud-based technology.
So I see many layers of techniques you have put in. One is the honor code and training, and then also some mechanisms to monitor the proper usage. So one thing with AI though, given it is being already used by software developers to also generate code, I think it makes the risk even higher beyond what you might have experienced. And so does that keep you awake in terms of how your IT team itself is using generative AI?
Yeah, in our organization, we don't do a lot of development, so we don't really run into that much, but I have in other organizations. Yeah, it's a good point, right? But if a company deploys or opens up the organization to be able to use certain AI technologies, you could do it responsibly. There's some that are not, anything you post are not shared with the learning model. It's contained within your own workspace that's controlled by your company. There's things you can do so that information is contained. But look, you could have someone go to their personal ChatGPT or some other technology and post code. That is the training and awareness, right? And that's reminding people nothing related to the company should be posted in an unapproved site, uncontrolled site, personal site, including things like ChatGPT or Copilot that's non-company managed, right? So that's training and awareness, and that has to continue periodically throughout the year. But if you, in my opinion, if you open it up at a company responsibly and you control it and employees are able to use that technology that you've deployed, they're not going to go and type that information in a personal AI model, right? They're going to do it in the company managed one. So there's controls, there's monitoring, there's safeguards to prevent customer data, social security number, driver's license being posted in there because you have data loss prevention control. So to me, it's better for a company to responsibly deploy it in a controlled fashion.
So Radha, when I was at IBM, we used to have, given you are a fellow IBMer, employee conduct guidelines. I'm picking up from where Mike was going. And we used to go through all kinds of very interesting scenarios to know what's the right thing to do given any situation. I would imagine now you probably have additional scenario as part of the employee guidelines around generative AI and the data governance and so on. So could you talk to that?
Yeah, they are enhanced every year to address. We had an enhancement when GDPR first took off as well, and other processes were put in place. Similarly, with the whole company working towards more Gen AI solutions for enterprises, there's been an enhancement to those guidelines as well. But and since we brought up code generation through Gen AI is actually a very important business case for, I think, all tech companies. But at the same time, I think it's very important that you have the appropriate guardrails in place when you produce this technology, when you work on it as well. And that, I think, is very essential. So these happen at different points. And just circling back to the previous question on the data. The data could have, overall it might be licensed, but it could have some harmful content. So it is very important when the model itself is undergoing its creation process that you have the right guardrails in place. The obvious ones are filters for hate, abuse, and profanity, but there's also for privacy protection and other guardrails that you would have as well. The other thing to keep in mind is there's a lot of concern around the data being used, but we are very ingenious as human beings. You might have seed data, which is very small in number. It is licensed, but you need to create a larger volume of data. There are now techniques for synthetic data generation, and that is like entirely under your control. So I think it's just applying all the tools that we have in the toolbox to really create a more responsible model is what everyone needs to keep in mind.
So training awareness, and Anusha, Radha brought up the point of this synthetic data generation. Immediately my head went to deepfakes, misinformation, because depending on how you synthetically create data, it can be put to good use and so on. Right up your alley to weigh in on that, and what protections, what guardrails that exist without just leaving them to the technologists per se.
Sure. Actually, this is really important to understand. I think Radha mentioned this too, Michael mentioned this too. There are existing regulations already on certain of these topics. For example, privacy, you've got the EU's GDPR, General Data Regulation Regime. You've also got the California Consumer Privacy Act, which is the CCPA, which is widely regarded as a very robust law. And so you've got to first make sure whatever you're already doing isn't violating existing laws. So that's one thing. And there's also laws around bad content, right? So specifically political content, for example, is heavily regulated already. And so now we're seeing some movement. So the federal regulations so far have just been more like guidances or non-binding. However, some states have already enacted laws specific to certain kinds of content. For example, deepfakes being used for political content. Some states have already enacted laws around that. Fakes that involve non-consensual sexual content, particularly involving minors, there are already laws around that. There's already laws that try to protect minors online. And so typically, for example, in a lot of terms of use and privacy policies, you're supposed to, if you're offering any kind of service that really shouldn't be offered to kids, you have to make sure that you have that in your terms of use. And also, not just that you're saying that you're doing that, but you're implementing safeguards that you're checking, whether that's through geofencing or collecting data or having somebody click specifically if a yes or no, are you older than 21? Are you older than 18? Those are the kinds of practices you need to implement to make sure that you're not putting out bad content out there.
Let me just check on the Q&A if there is any question that has come up, then we'll move into some ethical considerations. Radha, I'm going to actually put you on the spot and then take us through it. Ethical consideration. As a technologist, I'm concerned about it, and as a user or as a caregiver, for example, when people talk about Gen AI helping caregivers, I worry about the risks it poses on especially vulnerable populations. What should everyone be aware of?
I would say it's like any piece of technology. There is something to gain, there is something to lose. So always, I would say, be vigilant. In an enterprise case, within the enterprise, normally there are rules and regulations. And Mike also outlined a few on how his company is taking care of it. So In that scenario, it is, I think, perfectly safe to use for the most part. When you step outside and it's a personal user, and it could be, both of us are caregivers, so it could be my father who's on his iPad all the time. So there you have to sit with them and explain to them on some of the harms that could be possible. I am blessed that my father is even more cautious than I am, even at this age. But it is really important to figure out there are ways by which you can put in some other safeguards, even on their interfaces, as to how they use it. And also never ever give out any personal information. I think it was even emphasized in the previous panel. So whatever questions you ask, and typically, why would you need to ask a question? It's if you want to get more information. If it's just a newsworthy event you're looking at, my advice would be simple. Just go to the well-known news sources directly. And websites still work, or television still works. So get information from there. And if there is something that you're just looking up a medication thing or whatever, just go the route of talking to your doctor first, or talking to the pharmacist directly, rather than trying to do investigative journalism on yourself on the ingredients of a particular medication and where can you get it cheaper. Now, there are old-fashioned techniques. I think as a fallback option, they work pretty well. So don't underestimate the value of a telephone call to the official numbers, just some of those tips. But it is a very difficult world. More so, I think, for the younger generation, because I think this was also highlighted in the previous panel. They're constantly on their screens and they have to be educated more. And the social media companies really need to do a gold star standard job of putting the appropriate guardrails in place, because there I think the exposure is the most.
So one thing on the ethical consideration, what are the use cases or what applications the businesses develop themselves? Mike, that comes up all the time in the banking financial services world. When I was doing work in around mortgage servicing, if I build an AI ML solution, who is going to be left behind? That was always my worry in terms of AI providing certain recommendations. So the bias and discrimination. So what comes up in your conversation and how are you wrestling with these questions?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question, but in the context of my business, we're not going there. We don't have an appetite to go into situations at this point. We'll watch what other banks do. Well, at this point, we're not going to make decisions on loans or anything customer related. It's just not going to happen. We don't have the appetite for that, right? We'll watch what the banking industry does. When a lot of the big banks are in that space now and trying to do things in that area. I think I even read JP Morgan processed 40 years of data as part of some of their processes. We're not there, right? We may look at things, like I said, that are enterprise risk perspective, third-party risk perspective, policies, procedures against our standards, or policies, standards, and procedures against regulations, things like that. We're not going to use AI in the short term, not this year at least, on anything that would create where we'd have an issue with bias in making a decision. But I think personally, putting my corporate hat aside, from a personal perspective, I think these technologies, you have to get engaged in these technologies, because in 10-year time frame, if you're a bank, in my opinion, that doesn't support and use this technology for things like that you might be left behind. Right? I think it's about competitiveness, right? So we will watch it, and over the course of time, we'll make those decisions if we want to get involved with using the technology for more. But really, I'll summarize here. The key thing, I think, is stakeholders from around the company need to be engaged, right? They need to come together, right? And that's everything from risk professionals, security, technology, legal, and business operations. The leaders have to come together. They have to work together, and they have to make decisions together on the use cases that they're comfortable exploring with the technology. If you can't do it in silos, that's the key point.
Right, and I think government plays a critical role there in laying out the regulations, which is, I think Chaya is asking it in a different way. Who should be held accountable for harmful or misleading AI-generated content, including ones that may result in biased and discriminatory practices, Anusha?
Yeah, for now, we have to go with the framework that's already been established as it applies to other existing laws. For example, we already have a Civil Rights Act. We already have a robust anti-discrimination laws. For example, for the New York State Department of Financial Services launched an investigation into Apple credit cards because they were actually finding that women were getting significantly lower credit limits than men, with really similar backgrounds and income qualifications, credit risk analysis, all of that. And so why is that happening? Why was there an investigation? Because it's violating existing laws, right? And I think it's really important for developers and users to understand what the drawbacks are for your model, what the risks are related to your specific model that you're using or you're working on or you're developing. And that comes from not just training and awareness and education, but also testing. For example, some of these laws that are being proposed have specific requirements on testing. When I mentioned earlier that there's federal regulations proposed on deepfakes, right? Particularly as it relates to political content or sexual content. And in those regulations, one of the proposals is that you have to provide a legal recourse. You basically have to say, hey, I will be responsible for certain of these violations. And so there is some of that happening as well, where you are going to be required potentially to take responsibility going forward, even if currently the regulatory landscape is a little bit uncertain. The other place to really watch are all these court cases. In the US, we live in a common law system where courts make certain decisions, and then they're supposed to have precedents, and other courts then look to what has been previously decided. And so as these disputes that are open right now, investigations and things like that, as all of this plays out, it'll then affect what we'll expect to see in the future.
Is there one case, Anusha, that we should be following, even as a responsible citizen who is benefiting from the use of Gen AI in our personal lives as well as in our business lives? What should we be tracking to know how this is going to play out in terms of our safety?
Yeah, so I would say the most high profile disputes right now are really around the IP piece. And I think that's going to be major because if, for example, a court rules that, okay, you are violating all of these people's IP by using their data to train your model, then we're going to have to really see a huge shift in how these AI models are created, right? As Radha said, then we're going to see a bigger shift to maybe people are creating internal data sets or synthetic data sets. They're not going to the original data sets that they were before. So it is going to be a ripple effect into the industry. And then on the other side, if to the extent to which AI generated content is protectable is going to have a huge impact on whether people are going to use AI or not. Because if it's not protectable, then I think the business cases are going to reduce. And so there's a real balance here. I think that the theme that I keep seeing is how do we encourage innovation? How do we encourage all of these business cases, but then also make sure we're reducing harm as much as possible? And so those are the balancing factors that you'll see playing out in all of these disputes and unresolved issues.
So true. Without stifling innovation, how do you still make technical advances? With AI Act coming, even a small startup like me, I have to be conversant with what is coming up, what are the expectations of a business. So could you give a view into what technology companies like IBM are doing in order to be compliant? How are they getting ready for the compliance and adherence?
So what we always have is an integrated compliance process, which partners with research and development. And the reason for that is, as it all starts with data, especially in the Gen AI world, for you to use the data to train and then as an afterthought go and check whether you are compliant or not really is not the right approach. And we have a system in place where, when the decision is made, what new data is to be acquired, etc., we work very closely with our legal and privacy teams and go through a complete clearance process for the data. In fact, if many times when we have to acquire data, they are involved even earlier because there have to be the right terms and conditions in place for us to use the data from the entity we're purchasing it from, etc. So that's a very rigorous process. But the other aspect of it is also technical. It is very important to preserve this data, right? Because you've used it in your first generation model, but the model isn't static. You're going to keep training every year. Every year there'll be 3 or 4 different releases or whatever. You keep augmenting the data. And so it's very important to have the appropriate lakehouse technology where this data data is preserved. So over time, you know where the data was being used. And some of the licenses on the data could also be time bound. So for you to use it, say after 5 years again, then you have to make sure you've renewed the license. So having technology in place is absolutely key. We are fortunate to have that. It also helps us track. There are different flavors of the models that every company produces, and we are very enterprise focused, so they go in for different solutions across different business units. So that also makes it very important to know that how the data later on morphed into something else, was used in a different model. And as we produce our models throughout the process, there are different guardrails on it. The filters of HAP and other things get done even before pre-training or something. You just clean everything and put it through. But it's also important, this is after all a stochastic process. What the prompt asks, the model could answer in one way in one case and in another way in another case, just because the prompt was slightly altered. So it is very important to also have guardrails in place that the prompt is not being engineered for bad results, right? Like prompt injection is also an issue. So it's like along the entire process, even after model training, post-training, or when you do fine-tuning, making sure that there are the guardrails come into play even at those stages. So it's a very staged and managed process. And I think our legal team is more comfortable with that as well. As being at IBM, sometimes there's always friction between research and legal, but I think it's there for a reason. And so far, I think we've been able to work with all the guardrails. So that is helpful. You have to be aware of the risk. Sometimes legal ensures that there are some very high-level executives signing off on the risk. Then you have to mitigate the risk, and you have to mitigate it after release as well. So it's just a rigorous process.
Prompt sensitivity is something I grapple with on a daily basis in Amicus Brain. It seems magical that every time you ask a question, you get different answer. But in many situations, you want to provide reliable answer again and again,
yes,
regardless of what the prompts are, so, which is a very different world. So thank you for mentioning that and raising awareness to that. We have a few questions and of course, let's take them. So I think people are putting them in the chat itself. Yeah, so this one I'm going to open it up. So feel free to jump in, whoever, Mike, Radha, Anusha. It says, how can we ensure that generative AI models do not perpetuate or amplify biases in the training data? Maybe Radha, you want to kick it off and then Mike and Anusha can add?
Yeah, you have to have the right filters and guardrails in place. And there are some of the toolkits that were developed even prior to Gen AI, like, for example, IBM has the Trustworthy AI toolkit. I would say once you get the data, even using the toolkit that we have pre-existing for that era is very useful. This was for not just harms, but for biases introduced across certain populations or ethnicities, etc. So those tools are already available. I think our toolkit is also open source. Bias detection can be done even before training starts based on your data set. So that would be my suggestion. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember there was like more than 20 plus metrics that this is for the audience. If someone is getting data even from publicly reputed sources, it is still worthwhile to use those different kinds of data analysis measures to see that it doesn't have inherent biases and what the divergence is and balancing and so on. So this is a more of a philosophical one. How do we prevent over-reliance on AI-generated content, ensuring that human creativity and critical thinking remain central? Mike, I would like you to answer as a person, not representing the bank.
Yeah, look, I can only answer from my perspective, and I think AI is going to give you what you ask. And if you say, that's not what I'm asking, or no, you need to change that, you'll say it back to it, and it'll come back with another response. And now go back and forth. And then now it's just data that I've gotten, and maybe it gives me, I'm just picking a percentage, 70 or 80% of what I was asking for, but now I got to mold it into what I need it for, right? So it's Just like you do a Google search, I'm finding research. I'm not just taking that and that just 100% solve the problem. I still have to use that research to model it to what I'm actually trying to accomplish, right? So AI is the same thing. I'm not finding it that anything I've ever asked about stocks or personal, my future financial profile or strategy or anything that I've asked on a personal level, I can just say, hey, I'm going to use that 100%. It's just research, right? It's giving me good information in a very rapid pace. Some of it is right, and I'm often finding some of it is wrong, or it's too much, and that's not really concise. It doesn't really get to the point, or it's not really exactly what I need. So the point being is you use it, you have to interpret it, and you have to make it useful for the purpose that you're working on or that you need it for. I don't trust anything that an AI or anything I found online 100%. If I did some research online, I found 100 sites all telling me the same thing. Yes, I'm going to probably lean towards that's accurate. But you can't trust it fully, right? And I don't see that it replaces my job or any of the functions in my company, but it does make us better. It makes us more efficient. We can do things much more rapidly. And end of the day, I think it makes me smarter. Just when the internet came out, it made me smarter because I can research things like very rapidly. Now I can even do it faster. But you can't just fully rely on anything you get from AI, right? You have to do your research properly, and you have to take it for what it's worth. Some things are right, some things are wrong, because it may only provide you a response based on what you asked, and it may have interpreted it wrong on what you asked.
Absolutely. I used to say it raises the average competence. So people who don't have the facility, who are disadvantaged in some way, now AI can very meaningfully impact their communication and help them get their message across, like you said. Anusha, are we going to see a day? I always say, okay, now when I get an email, I don't know whether this is AI generated or someone really put in at least 30 seconds in writing some words. So are we going to ever see a day where researchers, we have to cite when we are referencing, when we are using actual words from someone else's paper? Are we going to get to a place where this is AI generated?
Absolutely. That is definitely coming down the pipeline. A lot of disclosure and transparency rules, not just around, oh, this is the content that's being generated by AI, but also, for example, California has a proposed rule right now where if you're using an AI model, I think it goes into effect next year, you have to actually disclose how you train that model, what data sets you use. So people who are using that AI can go to your terms of use, terms of service, and see, oh, how is this AI model actually being built, so that they can become a more responsible user as well. So absolutely, I think those kinds of disclosure and transparency requirements are coming down the pipeline. So if you are out there already using AI generated content, putting it out there, just get ahead of the game, start disclosing it, start labeling it. There's already some jurisdictions that have mandatory labeling requirements. Just get out there and start doing that as a best practice. And the other thing I was going to say, quick plug for SheTek. I did the AI Essentials Bootcamp, and initially, I think many years ago when AI first got talked about, there is this concern. It's, oh, they're just going to this machine is going to start creating things and it's going to take over human creativity. And you can see some of this also in the USPTO stance, right? They don't want it to stifle human ingenuity and creativity. However, I think taking that course and really understanding the business use cases, it makes you realize how much human involvement is actually required, right? How much you have to actually prompt the thing in order to get something back. It's not just magically generating something out of thin air, right? And I think some of the comment sessions with the USPTO was also educating the USPTO around this, right? There was a lot of practitioners being like, hey, no, this AI is not just thinking on its own, right? It's being trained according to my prompts, according to whatever data sets it's been trained on, right? And I think, yeah, I philosophically speaking, actually, because you're still prompting, you're still creating something. That's the argument that most proponents of AI are using to say, hey, I'm still being creative, right? I'm still the brain behind the idea, even if the AI is helping me implement or create that.
I think Niraj in the previous panel talked about that note LM where it is generating the questions automatically. So that the argument may not carry water for too long.
Of course, yes. As these sort of technologies are developing and you're seeing less human involvement, absolutely, that concern was going to be greater.
I've said, Nisha, about SheTek. I remember I was part of instructing a couple of cohorts, and it's very nice to see that this whole ethical considerations and what one needs to be aware of was a well thought out section in that. So if anyone is looking at that, that gives you, it's not just the technological hype and the excitement, but balance it with the risks that come along with it. Very good. More questions, legal questions. So you are in the spotlight, Anusha. What are some of the best practices a person or company can use to protect themselves legally when utilizing AI?
Sure. I wish we had Radha on because obviously the EU is often ahead of us. And so if you're going to see looking through the looking glass, regulations that often are implemented in the EU find their way in some shape or form in the US as well, or they touch the US. And so the EU AI Act would be really great to look at. In terms of best practices, I think it's really been up to the individual developers and the users because, as I've said before, there's not really a federal comprehensive regulation or legislation on this. But I think it really goes back to all sorts of system design. You have to come up with what are the principles that you're trying to protect. So whether that's bias or data privacy and security or disclosure and transparency, you have to identify what are your goals and then work backwards from there. How are you going to design your systems in order to achieve those goals? And when it comes to, for example, deep fakes or bad content, right? Do you have ways to detect that? Do you have ways to take it down? Do you have ways to take it out of your model? If not, then you need to implement those. So it really, as I said, you start with the principles and then you work backwards and try to incorporate them into your system design. And so it has to go into from the very beginning, right? Your planning stage, your testing phase, all of that, you need to be considering all of these principles.
I would encourage everyone to read at least the executive summary of the AI, just so that each of us know what our rights are and what they expect and how to look at anything that comes in front of us. I think there was a DeepSeek question, right? So where are the infrastructure? Where is the infrastructure located? That's a good question to ask. Where are all the prompts that you're presenting? Where are they going?
What are you doing with that data? Exactly. And where did you get your data sets from? Have you validated or verified those data sets? And then from a user perspective, are you educating your users on the shortcomings or potential shortcomings or risks behind your model? So that they can be better informed users of this as well.
Yeah, I would say that if you really want to try the models, you should look at the open source community, see what models are published in the open source. Because when you publish there, you do have to publish your model cards, which include all your data sources. And in good faith, you have to publish that. There might be nefarious actors who do not put some sources in the model card. But then in the open source community, it's really a level playing field, and nefarious actors get called out easily because everybody's busy trying different technologies. So in a very philosophical sense, I would say that do not underestimate the power of human ingenuity, because there are nefarious actors, there are also other vigilantes. It's a very good place to start from, I feel. And I think Mike said this in different ways. I'll just encapsulate it in a phrase of one of our former presidents, which is trust but verify, right? And the open source community is a good field for verification, I feel.
Documentation is so critical, right?
Yeah.
Radha, here, especially when you're thinking or when you're trying to demonstrate the explainability and the accountability, all the aspects of responsible AI. Is there a standard template that's...
Yeah, there is a standard template, and you can look up any model there, the Llama models, you can look up the IBM Granite models. I believe DeepSeek is also there. So they have had to publish their model cards and the training and everything. So it's all out there.
So the more we know and we examine those cards, we are empowered and informed.
Yes.
So we have more questions, which is fantastic. I don't know, we'll answer as many as possible. So we did, okay. When we think of Gen Alpha, the first real generation to grow up with AI integrated everywhere, what is most important to teach them? Parents, to be parents? Or so anyone, go for it.
Yeah,
I would say delay the start of screens. There's a lot in human interaction that even babies learn from, and they need to learn that. Delaying screens is not such a bad idea.
Yes, Mike, go for it.
Yeah, so I would just add like some of the things we talked about, right? So what have we learned on the pros and cons of using AI and the good practices and principles? And you want to instill those into the kids, right? It's the same thing, right? So I have a young daughter and I talk to her about it. Now, she can't use it yet because she's not of age, and she can't actually create an account on any of these sites. She's 10, right? So, but I still teach her and I show her about it. And then over the course of time, she'll learn what is right, what is good, what is bad, because they're curious. They ask questions. Many of them ask questions, lots of questions. Teach them, right? That's what I do as a parent. Is when I learn on things that I know that she may interact with, I'm going to try to teach her it, right? When she gives me time to listen, I'll try to instill that into her as well.
What measures should education institutions take to prevent? I'm trying to answer as many as possible from our audience. It's been fantastic, the engagement. What measures should education institutions take to prevent AI-generated plagiarism? Mike, when you're talking about it, I was just thinking some of the things that are coming up in the educational setup, right? What's the right use of? How much do you use? Prevent AI-generated plagiarism.
Yeah, so I have a little bit of feedback on that.
Yeah, go for
so
it.
there are some educational institutions, big names, and their faculty is split. So there is one section of the faculty which has said, yes, you may use Gen AI to get to some of the content for your research papers, but you have to cite and say this was obtained from this model, and this section was from there, this other section was from something else or whatever. But there is a section of faculty which has said absolutely no. And now what many of them are trying to get the absolutely no faculty on board, because this is an accepted reality now that everyone will have access. If it's going to help you improve your research, because if you know already this path has been tried, then you can go explore something else. So that's, I think, where things are right now in the educational community. There is also penalization if you use Gen AI for your answering a test or whatever, the paper that you were writing, but you don't declare it, and then it is found out, there is a stiff penalty. So
right. There are a lot of teaching moments there,
yes.
right there. My worry is in the flip side of it. I think some of the tools that schools and colleges use to detect plagiarism themselves are imbued with AI, which can declare a lot of false positives.
Yeah, and there's been cases around this already.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Anusha,
I was just going to say there's at least a couple of cases, yes, where a student, they have these AI detection tools that are also based on AI, and incorrectly, according to the student, said that the student had plagiarized and the student had gotten suspended, and now I think there's a lawsuit pending.
Look, we have about, at least my clock shows a minute left. Our topic was very heavy, complex, and so many ramifications. Things are still on the move, right? Open questions. So if our audience had to take one thing from our session, I see you, Anusha, go for it. What would be? And then we'll do a lightning round. Mike, Radha.
Yeah, this is going to sound silly, but I think critically. Think critically about everything that you see, right? Really examine everything that you're fact checking or verification or that human sort of oversight piece. I'm speaking from a user perspective because I'm not out there developing AI, but as a user, I have to verify everything that comes out. I have clients, as an attorney, I have clients that are asking me, hey, people are using AI to generate contracts. People are using AI to get things done. If you're going to do that, know the risks. Think critically about that. AI, the contracts that I've seen AI generate have not been great. I've had to go in and make lots of really important changes, understanding those shortcomings. And if something isn't great to use AI, don't use AI for that.
That's a great point. I'm going to switch to Mike. That's a great segue.
Yeah, I would just, it's been said several times, right? Trust but verify, put in the right guardrails, as Radha said several times, right? You just don't use it responsibly, right? Even if it's on a personal level, don't put in your own sensitive data. I'll put things that are sensitive to me, but not like what stocks I'm trading or things like that. But don't put your social security number, driver's license, other sensitive information or health information related to you. You've got to be very careful on those, right? So use it because it's valuable and may help improve your life, but also be cautious on who else is seeing and who else is seeing that information, who else is it shared with.
Radha, you have the last word.
Just believe in yourself. You have to make the judgment call. So be careful, as you would in all other things. In terms of technology, it's here to stay. So embrace it for its usefulness. But you don't have to always rely on it for everything else. It's even while driving a car, sometimes people automatically now just put in directions and start driving. My advice is, if you know the route, please don't even bother doing that, because as we grow old, the younger generation is okay. As you grow older, it's okay. It's better to exercise your brain, learning and doing something from memory and muscle memory is important. It's like even exercising, right? Why do we exercise? Do we really need to? Yes, we do. So this is like a brain exercise. Yeah, use it for information, but don't let the brain go idle.
Absolutely. I'm going to end with the joke. That's my constant argument with my husband. You've traveled this 1,000,000 times. Why do we need GPS to go to the grocery store? So on that, thank you, Radha, Anusha, Mike, being my peers and sharing so much here. And we can go on about these topics for hours, but we are going to stop. Joanne is there. And thank you, audience, for wonderful questions, which made us delve deeply into some of these very thorny issues. Thank you.